Hello everybody, my name is Kat and welcome back to my channel where we talk about all things horror. And today I'm doing another horror catch-up video. I did one of these a few weeks ago, primarily looking at films that had been released on streaming. And there were still a few films that I wasn't able to get to within that review. And then right after that, I had a friend send me this magazine article highlighting the best horror films of 2024 so far. And there were a few titles on that list that I had not seen yet. So I have 4 films that I watched that I'm going to be talking about today. And I will say I was actually pleasantly surprised by all of these movies. I actually enjoyed watching every single one for various reasons that I'll get into. But I will say off the bat here, while I personally enjoyed all of the films that I'm going to talk about on some level, I think these are films where some sections of the horror fandom are going to like certain movies, depending on taste and favorite subgenres and whether or not you like comedy and drama mixed in with your horror. I mean, I would recommend just checking them out to see for yourself. And while yes, there's definitely horror elements to them, I wouldn't specifically categorize any single one as being straight up horror. As I said, there's a lot of comedic elements being brought into some of these films. There's a lot of experimental elements being brought in. So they're not what I would strictly categorize as horror. There's definitely a lot of other types of genres and styles coming into these films. But let's dive in and talk about them. So the first film that I'm going to talk about is Sting. Now, Sting was a movie that I meant to watch when I did that first horror streaming catch-up video, and I mistook it for another film called Infested, which is a great film that is on Shudder, and you should definitely check that out if you haven't yet. But like Infested, which is all about a spider infestation, and the spiders go around killing people and get larger and larger as they do, Sting has a very similar premise. Sting is also about spiders. The difference here is that Sting is definitely taking a more whimsical approach. It's definitely taking a more horror comedy approach. It's very B-movie, sci-fi coded. And I had a lot of fun with this film, actually. 2024 is proving to be a great year for spider movies. I would also categorize this as a very family-friendly horror film in something of the vein of I don't know, I guess Gremlins. I don't think it's on that level, but it's taking that tone. And it's all about this family that is living in this apartment building. And you can tell there's definitely some challenging family dynamics at play here. You also have the grandmothers that are living in the apartment building as well. They live in the apartment next door. So it's definitely one of these very family focused type of films. And one night, just out of the blue, this, I guess it's a meteor or something shoots down from outer space, hits into the apartment building, and within this meteor is this alien spider that the daughter finds and takes into her bedroom. And of course, she wants to keep it as a pet. Unfortunately, the more that she feeds the spider, the more it gets bigger and bigger, and eventually it just wants to start feeding off of human flesh. So one of the reasons why I really liked this and why I had fun with it is the fact that it's very much leaning into the sci-fi B-movie aesthetic. This is definitely a love letter to B-movies. I mean, the film starts off with one of the characters sitting down in front of a TV and watching one of those old black and white sci-fi horror films. So it's very much letting you know at the beginning what type of film it's trying to be. And yeah, once I kind of figured that out and I saw, the meteor coming from outer space and hitting into the apartment building, I was like, you know what, I'm sold. I do tend to love things that are campy, and I think that this film definitely hits that spot. I think it's a very funny movie. I really liked a lot of the stuff with the grandmothers. There's also a exterminator that shows up throughout the film, and he was probably my favorite character in this movie. I thought he was hilarious. It was an easy film to watch. It's an easy film to kind of shut your brain off and just take it in. But I also think it has a really nice narrative in terms of the family dynamics, right? And you have a family that's kind of broken at the beginning and then has to learn to come together at the end. So I thought that was cute. I did like that aspect of it. I know that that's not something that is going to appeal to everyone. This is not a scary film at all. And again, it's not trying to be. I also really loved the cinematography in this film. It is taking place in this kind of dark apartment building, but then it has, all the fairy lights in the background, or all just the kind of neon lighting. Obviously, I am someone that loves the kind of fairy light, neon light look. Always a sucker for that in films. The spider itself, I mean, you can tell it's a CGI creation. But again, I think that kind of works here because it's not a film that's taking itself too seriously, right? Again, this is a film that right from the beginning is telling you what type of tone, what type of mood it's going to have throughout. What I also liked about this film from a narrative standpoint, and this film has something that a lot of films have been lacking lately, is that I feel like it has really good setup and payoff payoffs, right? Like they kind of set up throughout the film that the grandmother characters, the granddaughter doesn't really like to spend that much time with them because they're old and they like smell like mothballs. Mothballs do play a role in them figuring out one of the spider's weaknesses. So I really liked that. We're having like good setup and payoff in this film. It was fun. It felt like a very tight script. You know, it's not one of these films that's like really challenging the genre or doing anything new. In fact, by like the third act, it's borrowing very heavily from films like Alien or Predator. But at least what I did appreciate about this film is that you could tell it was homaging something like Alien and Predator without directly like copying and pasting what was done in those films. And I thought it was fun that this film is taking place like in an apartment building. I feel like we are starting to see more horror films that are taking place in apartments, again, whether it's this film or Infested or even something like Evil Dead Rise from last year. We've had so many horror films that have been set within suburbia and the typical suburban house. So it's nice to see films that are embracing more like urban settings and figuring out how to tell these stories within these kinds of different locations. You know, I do think this is a film that like some people are probably going to find pretty hokey. There was one point in the third act where I thought it was going to go in a completely different direction than what I was expecting. I was like, oh shit, like this film just took a turn. I have no idea what's gonna happen next. But then like that ended up not being the case. And so I was like, oh, okay, no, it's gonna go more of the, I guess, safe route. If you are the parent of an older child or young teen and you wanna start getting them interested in the horror genre, this would probably be a safe one to start with. You know, it has some like strong language to it, but again, it's not like over the top with the gores or the scares. Do you know what I also loved about this film is that it had a certain like coziness to it as well. And they very much set up that outside there's a huge like snowstorm coming. There's like this blizzard that's coming in that's kind of trapping everyone in their apartments. It was one of those things where it was like, if I was still like a young kid living in New England, this would be a film that I would want to throw on when I had like a snow day or something, right? It kind of has like those nice like winter vibes to it. It's a good seasonal film. So if you're into that, if you like those kinds of movies and you just want something that's maybe a little cozy, this would be a good shot for you. If you're looking for something that's much more darker, and has a little bit gore, has a little bit more grit to it, then I would say watch something like Infested. So the next film that I watched is I Saw the TV Glow. Now, this was a film that I've been wanting to see for a while. Finally came on streaming, was finally able to sit down and watch it. And to say right off the bat here, this is not strictly a horror film. I know it's being categorized as a horror film. I know people are talking about it as a horror film. It's really more of a, I would say, psychological drama, more of a character study that has horror elements to it. It's really the situation that this character is in. Like it's the situation that is horrific, but the film is not like a horror film. What does that mean? Let me explain. So the film primarily follows the protagonist, Owen. We start off with him as a little kid, and then we see him as a teenager, and eventually we do follow him into like adulthood. But you can tell from the beginning he's very much an isolated child. One day he ends up running into this girl, Maddie, who is a few grades ahead of him, and they end up bonding over this TV show called The Pink Opaque. Now, Owen actually hasn't seen the show, but he's interested in it, but he can't watch it because it comes on like too late at night and his mom won't let him watch it. Him and Maddie devise a plan where he's able to come over to her house for a sleepover. They watch the show, and then it's very much them kind of bonding and creating this friendship out of a love and fandom for this TV show. And then this is where we get a little bit more experimental. This is definitely one of those films that's taking a more experimental approach to its storytelling. But essentially what happens is Maddie disappears, and then you learn later on that what happened to her is she figured out a way to bend reality, essentially, and kind of go into the television, go into the show of The Pink Opaque, and then come out an entirely like different person, right? She's transitioned from one individual into another. So if you don't know the writer and director of this film, Jane Schoenberg, I think is how you say their name, they do identify as transgender, and so this film is very much a metaphor or an allegory for the realization that one is in the body of the wrong gender. TV and going into the show and then like transitioning and coming out a different person. All of this is supposed to be a metaphor for things like gender dysmorphia. So this is a film that's very much talking about their experience moments with that, and the struggle of trying to figure out, like, do you actually make the transition or do you not? The horror in this film is that you have this character, Owen, who is just kind of stuck in this in-between place, right? Where it's like, kind of has an idea and a desire of who he wants to be, of the life that he wants to be. And again, he's very much getting an understanding of that through this like television show. But at the same time, like being afraid to actually embrace that part of him, actually embrace his true identity. And the older that he gets, the less time that he has to be able to fully embrace who he is. So that's where like the horror is coming in here, right? It's this kind of horror of just like being stuck. It's the horror of not living in, I guess, integrity, right? In terms of like living as your true self. It's the horror of, you know, just trying to conform, right? And doing whatever like society or people tell you to do. This combined with the more experimental elements of it, that is just going to make it a film not for everyone. I feel like this film actually has really strong themes. It has a very strong thematic through line. What I appreciated most about I Saw the TV Glow is, on the one hand, it's talking about this very specific experience, right? It's talking about this very specific experience that the writer and director actually went through. But on the other hand, the way that they're exploring this experience is through these very universal themes, right? Themes, again, around identity, around a lack of identity, around getting older, around like time slipping away from you, around just how, you know, you can just wake up one day and, you know, years and years have gone by and it's like, well, what have I done with my time? I mean, I'm in my 30s and I'm feeling this, so the film definitely resonated with me, at least in that sense. So again, I think it's doing a really great job of balancing like a very specific individual experience, but exploring that experience in these universal ways that even if you haven't gone through this particular experience, you can still identify with the main character, you can still empathize with the protagonist. That's what I think is the strength of this film. Another thing that I really liked about both of the characters in this film is this kind of love and fandom for this TV show that they have. This is a film that is taking place, I think, in the late 90s or early 2000s. Definite millennial vibes to it. So I think that's another reason I was able to connect to it just as like a millennial, because I was like these characters, whereas like, you know, I would go to high school and just do whatever I had to get through the day. And then I would come home and watch like my comfort shows. There's one scene where Owen and Maddie are like sitting on the bleachers outside of school, and Maddie is asking Owen, like, do you like girls? Like, who are you attracted to? And Owen doesn't really have an answer for that. And all he says is like, well, I think I like TV shows or something like that.
I think that I like TV shows.
I feel like I can relate to that so much. In high school, I was very much the kid, like I kept to myself most of the time. And then after school, I would go and work. And the part-time job was more important to me because I was getting my own money. And then with that money, I was able to go and buy movies or buy box sets of TV shows, right? And so then I could just be spending like hours and hours watching like film and TV. And that's really what got me interested in making and analyzing film. And I think that's another thing that we can all identify with too, right? Like we all have our comfort films, our comfort TV shows, or even like books, music, you know, whatever, some form of art that helped us get through a particularly bumpy road in our lifetimes. Film and TV especially can be really great sites of kind of figuring out your identity and kind of like what it is that you like, what you don't like, right? If there are certain characters that you feel an affinity towards, and maybe allowing us a portal of being able to take on different identities through different points of views and different types of characters. So I did like the metaphor that was being used here of the TV show as the thing that kind of gets these characters to think about their identities. Also, just the aesthetics of the Pink Opaque show. As soon as they showed the first clip of it and they show like the titles of the TV show, right, like the credits, immediately I knew it's in the same font as the credits of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, because as a kid, that's what I would watch when I came home from school. So I recognize that it was very much homaging that show. Also has a lot of like, feels like a lot of Nickelodeon shows as well, kind of like Are You Afraid of the Dark? Again, very millennial coded. It's also bringing in elements of very much giving a lot of Twin Peaks vibes in certain parts. I think you can definitely feel a lot of like David Lynch influence in here. And again, it's very like subtle and it's more about creating like a mood and an atmosphere. For example, there's one scene where Owen is in the car with his mom and his dad. And you can tell that there's some kind of like tension between him and his father, right? But they're in the car and it's like dark and it's at night and you can't really see like the dad, like he's kind of like framed like to the side. So you're not really like seeing his face that much. And he's asking his mom if The mom can ask the dad if he could go over to his like friend's house to have a sleepover. The mom and Owen are talking about the father as if the father isn't like right there with them. And then the father isn't saying anything or not even like acknowledging them. There's something about that has a very eerie quality to it. This is what I'm saying. It's kind of Lynchian in that this should be a normal scenario, but there's just these kind of little things about it that feel off. And because it feels off, that kind of ups like the danger. So I really appreciated those elements of this film as well. I love the visuals this film creates. This film has a very like creative spirit to it. Again, very much using the like fairy lights and neon lighting that I love. The way that the film ended kind of haunted me for a few days after I saw the film. I kept thinking about it. So again, I loved this movie, but it is not one for everyone. If you are someone where you're like, I'm not into like the experimental stuff, probably not for you. Although, as with all of these kind of more experimental films, I always still say like, give it a chance, because you never know when something like this might hit you, right? Otherwise, I would highly recommend this movie. I really loved it a lot. Okay, up next is The Coffee Table. This is a film that I knew nothing about going into it. So I saw the synopsis of it, which is basically like, you know, this couple, they have a newborn baby, they are furnishing this apartment, and they end up buying this coffee table, and then all hell kind of breaks loose from there. So I went into it thinking like, okay, is this gonna be like a haunted coffee table? And when they do introduce the coffee table, it's very strange. Like it's like a glass table that's held up by this gold frame, and the frame is made of these two like goddess figures, and these are goddesses that are supposed to like grant you like your one true wish, or like grant you wishes. So as they were setting this up at the beginning of the film, I was like, oh, okay, this is gonna be kind of like where we're going, right? Where it's like this table promises pleasure and riches, but then like what they actually give you is gonna be, you know, completely horrific. And then it goes in a direction that I was not expecting, and there was a good part of this film where I was watching it and I was like, what the hell is going on here? This is a film where I don't want to give too many plot details, because it's kind of one of those films where it's like, it's better if you go into it not knowing anything about this film or what happens. And again, this is not like strictly horror here. There are horrific things that happen. What I will say is, yes, you have the characters, they get this coffee table, and then the coffee table is involved in a very horrific incident that happens. This is an incident that happens to the husband while he's home alone, and then he tries to hide it from his wife. This is another apartment setting film. So you have like neighbors like kind of coming in and out and being nosy. So that's kind of like the running joke of the film. This is a film that has a very dark sense of humor. The humor is coming from the fact that you have this character that is stuck in this position, and you can tell that they are using every fiber of their being to try to keep this secret in, but it's like driving them crazy. Meanwhile, you have all these characters like coming in and out and just going about like their everyday lives. And that's it. That's pretty much the whole movie. This is a Spanish horror film. It is a film from Spain. And yeah, it is bleak, it is dark, not just in like the story, but also in the cinematography, right? Like everything is just very kind of bland, not a lot of color going on. But I think it very much mirrors like what is happening inside the character as well, what's happening inside their psyche. And again, a lot of like really dark humor in this movie. So if you're somebody that likes those kinds of films, I would definitely say give this a shot. Just a warning, because there is some stuff with like children here that is pretty disturbing, and I think if you are a parent of a young child, I don't know if I would recommend this film. But if you are someone that kind of likes more slow burns, then yeah, try this film out, because it's really interesting what it's doing with the narrative. And the film is just literally taking you through this afternoon of them, you know, trying to keep the secret from their family, and they're kind of being weird, and the family kind of notices that like the dad's acting weird, and it's kind of like, well, what's going on here? Like what's wrong with you? And it's one of those things where it's like the other characters don't realize what's going on until like much later in the film. I could see where some people would watch this film and find it very annoying. And admittedly, I found it annoying at times. And I do think that is the intention of the director, because they are very much trying to put you as the viewer in the same position, in the same headspace that the protagonist is in. So I appreciate kind of what the filmmakers were doing here. And that's why I enjoyed the film, because I was like, okay, you had a vision for how you wanted to film this, and you stayed true to that vision all the way until the end. But I think some people could definitely find the approach here a little annoying, a little slow, a little boring. And there's very much a like maddening quality to it as well. Again, the film is very effective at making you feel like what the protagonist is feeling, right? Just this kind of like slow descent into madness, right? Where by the end you just want to be like screaming at these characters like, this is what's happening. And I think this film does very well with like playing with the power of suggestion, right? And the film actually like never shows you anything that gruesome. It's all just kind of like in suggesting what's happening. It's one of these films that's very much letting you as a viewer, letting your imagination kind of run wild. So it's a very unique film, and I would say definitely check it out if you're just into a kind of different like storytelling approach. And it is a film, much like I Saw the TV Glow, that did kind of stick with me a few days after watching it. Just because it's kind of one of those films where it's like, it's not going for like the supernatural, you know, haunted coffee table thing. It's actually taking a more like kind of real life approach and kind of like these horrific real life possibilities that could happen. I think that's where, again, the horror is coming in, right? In the sense that it's like, you can wake up one morning and just be going about your normal day. And again, like one bad moment happens and your entire world is flipped upside down. The horror is definitely playing within like that space. So I think that's why the film stuck with me for a few days after I watched it. Okay, so the final film that I watched is Humane. This was another film that I didn't know anything about going into it, and it's another film that I will warn you is definitely leaning more into like the drama side of things rather than the horror. Again, we're having another film where it's like the situation and environments that the characters are living in is like the most horrific part. What is interesting about this movie is that it is directed by Caitlin Cronenberg, who is the daughter of David Cronenberg. I think this is her directorial debut, I want to say. Now, within the past few years, we've been getting a lot of children of either famous horror directors or children of famous people within the horror genre getting interested in filmmaking and kind of taking the reins and making their own films, right? And some of those results have been not the best. So when I saw that Caitlin Cronenberg was directing this, I did go in with a little hesitation because I was like, okay. However, I actually think she did a pretty good job with this movie. This is a film that takes place like few years into the future, in which environmental degradation has gotten so bad to the point where there is just not enough resources for everyone on the planet. So basically all of the countries have gathered together and have created this accord or this agreement in which all of the countries agree to euthanize a certain percentage of their population just to make sure that the world doesn't run out of resources like food and water. And you find out that the US has essentially created this draft system. When we start the film, it is a voluntary draft, right? People can volunteer to be euthanized by the government, and if they do that, then their surviving family members do get a certain amount of money. So I was excited going into this film and kind of seeing this is what the premise was, because I've said it before, I love eco-horror movies. And what I really loved about this film is that, you know, this isn't like post-apocalyptic world. We're not in like, you know, Mad Max wasteland here. We're still very much in a world that resembles our own, but you can definitely tell that things are not great, right? The film starts off and you see like a line of people waiting by this like big water truck, and they're all waiting just to get, you know, their small rations of drinking water. Or throughout the film, like you see characters that are walking around outside and they all have these like special umbrellas that they're using. It's like these heat resistant umbrellas because they can't be out in the sun. They can't let the sun in because the sun has gotten too hot, right? It's too hot to deal with. And so I liked that. I liked that it was a much more like simple approach. Having access to clean drinking water or having to find like shelter from the blazing heat, like these are already issues that we're dealing with in real life. It's showing us a world that, you know, feels very similar to our own, which I think is what gives it this kind of eerie feeling. If anything, I wish the film had leaned a little bit more into like the eco-horror side. We definitely get a lot of it at the beginning, and then as the film goes on, it kind of becomes more about this family. You don't really get a lot of the environmental stuff. It's definitely more hinted at. This is a story about a rich family. You have the patriarch, who is this well-known journalist, or he was a well-known journalist. He has since retired. He has a wife who is a world-renowned chef, and then you have their children. This is a film that's very much in the same vein of something like, I don't know, I guess like Ready or Not, or maybe You're Next, although I don't think this film is on the same level as those movies, but it's similar in the sense that you have, right, like super rich family. that is very dysfunctional. And then what ends up happening is you find out that the father has essentially put them in a position in which the family needs to sacrifice one of their own, right? One of them needs to voluntarily euthanize themselves. So it then becomes a scenario of them having to figure out like, okay, who are we gonna kill? So it's very much kind of one of like those movies, right? Like rich dysfunctional family that has to figure out like how to kill each other. So if you're into like those kind of stories, this might be one for you. What I liked about this film a lot is the kind of darker comedic approach that Caitlin Cronenberg is taking here. This is actually a very funny movie. Like it's not a film that's taking itself too seriously, despite very serious issues that it's raising. It definitely has a very playful tone to it. One of my favorite characters is, I think his name is Bob. He's like one of the guys that is in charge of like the euthanizing. And you just have these scenes with him and like one of the family members' daughters, right? You have a granddaughter that's also in the picture, and they just keep kind of like going at each other. She's like blaming him like, oh, your generation is the one that like got us into this mess. And then he'll like come around and be like, well, you guys are so miserable and depressed all the time. So very much kind of like playing on these different generational aspects as well that I thought was very funny. So there is a humor to this film, although I will say Cronenberg is also throwing in a lot of like political commentary here. There's a lot of characters bringing up things, whether it's related to climate change or whether it's related to like health insurance, things like immigration, right? Like she definitely has a lot of opinions and a lot of thoughts about certain political issues that she is making known through the dialogue of her characters. I didn't mind it, but I know for some people, for some audience members, like that would probably be a little annoying. I will say, while I did like this movie for the most part, and I did like a lot of the characters, I did feel like the narrative got a little bogged down in like the end of the second act to the beginning of the third act, right? There's kind of a lot of back and forth between the family members and between like, you know, Bob and the granddaughter. We keep having to go back to them. And yes, it's very funny at first, but because the narrative keeps like kind of going back and forth, it does start to feel a little old after a while. It does start to feel like, okay, can the plot like move on and kind of give me something else? It does get more interesting again towards the end of the third act. It gets a little stale within the second act, third act. And again, there's not a lot of horror here. There's some gore, like towards the end of the movie. There's actually not a lot. Like that's not really what Cronenberg is interested here. She's not giving you like extreme body horror like her dad. And it makes sense because I think when you take in the movie as a whole, for her to like show extreme gore or to like spend so much time on that, like it actually would kind of undermine the overall message that she's trying to give with this movie. This is actually more a movie about, you know, unity and coming together. The family has to come together and figure out how to get out of this awful situation that they're in. And I think that's supposed to be metaphorical for like speaking about like society as a whole. So I think for her to actually like focus on violence and focus on gore and kind of, you know, revel in that like a lot of horror movies do, I think that would have actually gone against what she was trying to say, which I think is why she pulls back from doing that. But again, that does place the film more in a kind of like drama, dark comedy space rather than a horror one. So this definitely wasn't my favorite film out of the four. I am really interested to see what Caitlin Cronenberg does next. I think this film does have a really good style to it. I could definitely see her kind of going down this route where she's much more focused on like social like horrors that we have to deal with every day. So I'm really curious to see what she does next. That's it. Those are the four films that I watched. Again, I really enjoyed viewing these films. It was a really nice mix of different styles and different kind of themes being explored. Have you seen any of these films? If so, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Let me know if there's any films on streaming that I should check out that I've missed, and I will see you next time. Thank you so much for watching.